Welcome back to Leveraging Leadership, where we unpack the art of business leadership. I'm your host, Emily Sander, Chief of Staff turned Executive Leadership Coach. I work with people to help them step into effective leadership and realize their professional and personal goals. If you have known failure and success, if you have had good bosses and bad bosses, if you are a high achiever and want new ideas, and if you want the practical and tactical side of things, then you are in the right place. This show is all about finding your points of greatest influence and leveraging them to better serve those around you. And today we are joined by Dr. Helen Ofosu, and she is joining us Canada.
Yes, I'm in Ottawa, Canada. Our
Beautiful. Well, welcome to Leveraging Leadership.
I'm so excited to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
Beautiful. So as a beginning, can you just, in a nutshell, kind of tell the folks who you are, what you do, what you're passionate about, and maybe touch on what is career psychology?
Okay. So professionally, I'm an organizational psychologist. So for anyone who follows Adam Grant, that kind of work, I've been doing it, I don't want to say how long, but a while. Over 20 years. So you understand why. Sometimes with private sector clients, sometimes with government organizations or nonprofits. And my work kind of has a few buckets. So one bucket is organizational stuff where maybe doing hiring on behalf of an organization or applied research or some kind of an HR intervention if something's kind of gone sideways. Another chunk is the coaching that I do. Sometimes with professionals who are individual contributors, lots of lawyers, lots of teachers, engineers, kind of a mixed bag, but then a lot of executive coaching as well. So leaders who are facing bigger mandates or seeing challenges coming up or want to kind of level up for something. And again, it could be private sector, nonprofits.
Thank you for that. So you do have a book, and let me get the title right. So How to Be Resilient in Your Career, Facing Up to Barriers at Work. And that is available now wherever books are sold, by the way. We will have a link in the description, but I wanted to dig in to a few specific chapters here with some meaty topics. So your chapter 3 is about imposter syndrome, which I've personally dealt with. And I know a ton of my clients, and I'm assuming a ton of my listeners, have dealt with that or are dealing with that as well. So hot topic. So my working definition of imposter syndrome would be when you're sitting in a room and you have the experience and you have the credentials and you have every right to be there, but you don't feel like you should be at that table. And I've sat at a conference room and I'm like, I should not be here. I am not as good as these people around me. Yet everything else would tell you that I'm a valuable member of the team, right? So that's my kind of working definition of imposter syndrome. But I wanted to turn that over to you and get your definition of it.
Well, that is a terrific definition. That's pretty much what I would have said as well. Like you, I've experienced it, but I try not to let it hold me back.
Mm.
And I think the big issue for most of us is realizing, okay, sure, there may be times when maybe it's a new position or a new mandate or whatever. So you feel a little bit uncertain, right? I'm sure when you had your first book, you're wondering, gee, am I really an author now, right? Like now that your book's out there in the world. And I think half the battle is realizing that other very successful people have also lived with it, but they still do what they need to do, right? My favorite examples are Maya Angelou and Michelle Obama. I could only hope to be as successful as either of them, right? And if they've experienced it and they still have gone forward and done what they wanted to do or what they thought they could do, it's a good permission for the rest of us.
So I think, first of all, if you're feeling like an imposter, you're in good company. So that's kind of point one. And then I was wondering, what are your insights on what is happening when we feel that sensation? Because part of it's illogical, and I know we're not completely logical, rational beings. We run on emotion, but what's happening in that moment?
Well, I mean, sure, yeah, emotionally, it's kind of like a stress response or whatever, right? So, but I think relating to your point, sometimes we forget that we are feeling first and thinking later in most instances. We're often encouraged to try to be rational. And most of the leadership stuff out there is all about, the thinking and the hard skills. But the truth is that if we ignore some of what we're feeling, sometimes we're ignoring some good insights. Not necessarily with imposter syndrome, because the feelings might say, don't do it, when, when really we should still try to do it. But what I really want to get at is how the imposter syndrome plays out for certain people. Most of the literature out there is written for the majority, but not necessarily sensitive to some of what some of us are feeling, whether you are a religious minority, a racial minority, a member of the LGBTQ2S plus community, differently abled, neurodiverse, whatever. And sometimes when you're not part of the typical mainstream, the other advice may not really scratch that itch, so to speak, may not quite capture our experience. So, in my experience, sometimes when we are sort of an outsider because of our unique identity, it might not be regular imposter syndrome. I think it's actually more an imposter treatment.
Hmm.
So, where I'm going with this is that despite all the attention that equity, diversity, and inclusion gets, and sometimes there's a tax on it, making it seem as if all the people who are traditionally underrepresented are only getting opportunities because the standards are being lowered. The truth doesn't bear that out. Usually, when you are part of a minority, you're really good because you wouldn't even get a chance
Right.
if you weren't at least as qualified as everybody else. Sometimes you're more qualified than everybody else just to get that initial chance. And usually, when you're, pushing back against or trying to uh, provide evidence that's opposite to the negative stereotypes, you're pushing against a lot, right? And so you're treated as if you don't belong. You're treated as if your contributions don't matter or aren't as valuable. And I think after enough years of that, when you're treated that way, that's really what's triggering the imposter syndrome for some people.
So, is the distinction between imposter treatment and imposter syndrome, the former is based on external events and behaviors, and then imposter syndrome is the internal, like, okay, well, if this is my environment, I'm being treated this way, it kind of sinks in at some level?
Exactly.
Okay.
And with the imposter treatment, it's not so much that you don't feel or think that you're good enough, but you've been treated that way for so long that all of a sudden that kind of becomes your reality. So it's more imposter treatment that looks like imposter syndrome.
Okay. So, whether someone is experiencing imposter treatment or imposter syndrome, I guess the key question in all of this is what do we do in that moment? So we have a little bit of we're certainly not alone in this and, feelings versus action and logic and all of that. But what does someone do when, they're sitting at that table and they're like, I either am being treated like I don't belong here or I internally don't believe I belong at this table. So speaking up is something that I'm not going to be prone to do, even though that might be what's best.
Yeah. I think a big piece of it is some pre work.
Mm.
Usually we know when we have big meetings or presentations or opportunities. So we kind of, in those times when we're preparing, we of course prepare carefully, but also remind yourself of how much you've done and how much you've earned this opportunity. And one of the hacks that I have is that when I start to feel nervous, I say, well, no, wait a second. This is just adrenaline because it's so exciting. And so if you sort of reframe certain things, it just helps you process some of those emotions in a way that will serve you better.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, there's so much in there too. It depends on the certain it depends on the situation, but sometimes if you have been promoted or you have been moved into a certain position, that invitation to be in that room is the validation. It's not that you have to necessarily prove yourself over and above once you're there. I think sometimes in some situations, the fact that you were even invited to a seat at that table says a lot.
Mhm. And I think another thing that sometimes swirls in certain people's minds is this whole piece around tokenism,
Mm.
right? So they may think, well, sure, I've got this opportunity, but maybe it's because they were trying to be diverse.
Check a box. Yeah.
Exactly. And so sometimes I like to reflect on what happened in the States some years ago. I'm sure you're familiar with the US college scandal.
Hmm.
And, I'd like to remind myself that all of those kids who got admitted to programs where they actually didn't belong and didn't deserve to
On
be,
merit.
they didn't worry about it. They had their shot and they just made the best of it.
Mm.
Right? So in that case, if you've earned your spot, be like them. Just make the best of it. Meanwhile, we're talking about people who've earned their place. Sometimes multiple ways they've earned their place.
Mhm. Okay, so that's one scenario. And just going back to the scenario where I was at that conference table and it was my first leadership meeting. I think I had been promoted. I was very young. I had been promoted to director, and that got me in the leadership meeting at the company I worked for. And Dr. Helen, I remember sitting there. I can picture it to this day, and I looked around the room and I literally was like, I should leave because all of these people are older than me and more experienced, and they're so professional and they're so senior and they use big words and they have all these, graphs and spreadsheets. And I'm little old Emily sitting here and I'm a fraud. I'm a fake. And I was invited into that room. I was promoted into the director role, but I still didn't feel worthy of being there in that moment. And in fact, when we did our round robin, everyone gave their updates on their team. I looked down and I said, no update. And everyone kind of chuckled because it was my first meeting. And
Sure.
afterward, I felt so bad because I was supposed to be representing my team in that meeting. And that was just a poor showing on my part. So long story short, I was like, Emily, you're an ambassador for your team. So it doesn't really matter how you feel. You need to do the job, which is to speak up for your team, speak up for our clients in my case. And that piece almost overrode my fear or imposter syndrome. So I'm wondering, is there, you can feel something and feelings are real to a certain extent, but not necessarily have to dictate our action. Is there something that kind of overrides that? I care about how I feel, but I care about representing my team well more.
That was a great intervention you did for yourself.
It took a while. It was not as easy as I made it sound. It was a long journey.
Another one I like to think about, it's kind of a two-parter. So the first part, especially right now, we're in a moment where there are a lot of things that are swirling and changing very quickly, right? Like most leaders don't even know if their business models will make sense 10 years from now because of AI.
Mm.
So whenever somebody feels like maybe they have maybe an invaluable perspective because they're kind of an outlier or something, I remind them that sometimes when you have a fresh perspective,
Mm.
that's exactly the perspective that people need, especially in moments like now where collectively we really know what's coming, right? So seeing things differently, treat it as an asset instead of a liability.
I was just
Mhm.
working with a client and she was brought in to to help turn around a culture. And it had been family owned for, several decades. And they knew they needed a change. But when the rubber meets the road and you actually are in that room having to talk to people who have been entrenched in a certain way of doing things, it can feel like an uphill battle. And to your point, it is, they actually need this. They actually need a different perspective, and it might make them feel uncomfortable, and they might default into, oh, she's different. I'm going to make her feel like an outsider. And so you have to kind of go through that initial process and then eventually get to the, all right, I'm turning the Titanic 1 degree at a time and getting this thing pointed in the right direction. So sometimes you could be in that moment. It's like, yep, this doesn't feel great.
Well, it may not feel great, but sometimes organizations need somebody who can see around corners that they
Yes.
maybe didn't even notice were there.
Yes. Iceberg dead ahead. Let's turn. Yes. So maybe let's flip the script a little bit. So if you're
Another point.
sure.
Okay. So again, if you're in a room where you feel like, oh my goodness, everyone else is X, Y, or Z, and I'm not that, it can make you feel small,
Mhm.
make you feel unimportant. But there's an analogy that I love. Um, Most of us have experimented with a drop of food coloring in a glass of water or a glass of that one drop changes that environment completely. So the point is that even if you are the only one with with a different perspective, a different backstory, a different, um, I don't know, if it's a multidisciplinary thing and you're the only one with your background, it still can have a very big impact. Share it and see what happens because they brought you in for a reason, right?
I love that visual. Yeah. So be that little droplet, bink, and then it changes the color of the water. Yeah. Just a little bit, but it does its job.
Mhm.
So that would be the equivalent would be, speak up, say that thing like, oh, I have an idea, or oh, no, I think, they're missing something, or oh, we should consider this. Like, just speak up, say something, and like, blink, little droplet.
Same thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Really.
Yes. All right. So flipping the script, if you are sitting on the other side and you're part of the leadership team and you're defining or designing this culture, what are some things that maybe one can do when they're trying to make other people feel confident and capable and empowered and encouraged to speak up and bring a diversity of thought and experience to the table?
One of my tricks is to have a very bottom up approach.
Mhm.
In most organizations, if you have the senior people speak first and
Yes.
say a briefing, everyone just steps in line.
Yeah.
So I like to speak last. Let other people speak first. And maybe, if there's a hierarchy in that room, have a reverse hierarchy in terms of who speaks first. Because often you get all kinds of wisdom and pearls that you might not otherwise hear.
I think that's a great tip, and I've actually experienced that. So, in the same company, in the same team where I was the youngest in the room, we had a large strategic planning initiative. So, we were defining our mission and vision and strategic objectives and all these different things. And during one of those initial meetings, we had a facilitator and they would ask us questions about, why our company existed and all these things. And because I was the most junior in the room, I would speak first. And at first, I didn't know there was a methodology. So I was like, why does she always call on me first? And then it ends with our co founder, who was a very like big, loud, strong personality who was right next to me. And I always felt bad when I would say something, it would go all the way around the table. Most people would say something different. And then he, who was sitting right next to me, said something contrary to what I said. And I was like, oh my gosh. But looking back at that, I now see what was happening, which is exactly what you described, which is where if I were to have spoken in the middle or last, there's no way I would have given the same answers. And
You'd
so
be
that
like,
was, yes.
pass.
Yeah, exactly. I was like, no comment. But because I was called first and put on the spot, they did get that unfiltered,
Mhm.
genuine answer from me. So I think that's a great point, and that can be used in any sort of meeting or any sort of group setting. But people take their cues from their leaders, so speaking last is a good idea.
Yeah, because leaders often don't hear things unfiltered.
Hmm.
Uh, in a bad climate, they don't hear things unfiltered because everyone wants to just say the thing that might make that person feel good, feel comfortable. But depending on what the stakes are, they just need to know the real thing.
Hmm. And you're right, they do get sanitized and a sugar coated version of what's happening. And I mean, they're basing big, sweeping decisions on
Uh,
bad data. And so if you can give them, eh, deliver it in a way that's going to be effective, but give them the information so they have it to make an informed decision. So,
uh,
yes. And I think for leaders who are truly interested in, I want the real data, I want to be informed, even if it's not what I want to hear. Speaking last is an easy way to do that. You can kick off the meeting, frame up the conversation, and then, Dr. Helen, or you wouldn't be the most junior, but Emily, what's your opinion on that? Oh,
Reminds me of what they're kind of contemplating with AI right now, because of course, these models are kind of sweeping the internet, but there's a lot of junk on the internet.
yes. Yes, there is. All right. So your chapter 6 is about toxic workplaces. So this is a large topic that can go in a multitude of directions, but what's the area that you like to focus on in terms of toxic workplaces?
For me, the core of it is any workplace where people are feeling hurt is a workplace where you're not going to get the best work,
Right.
right? So it doesn't matter whether the mistreatment is bullying, harassment, or some kind of discrimination. All of them are creating harm. All of them are creating situations where people feel they have to protect themselves. And basically, you may be paying somebody their full salary, but maybe 20% or 30% of all of their energy is going into protecting themselves. So how do you get good value out of that situation? You're working out of 70% instead of 100.
Mhm. So, in terms of energy and their focus and optimizing that person's talent, you're literally negating their full
Yeah,
capacity, right?
absolutely. So you have, I mean, if you're a decent person, then there's a moral imperative to do better and a practical imperative. So in a way, it's a very nice alignment.
Be a good person and get the most out of your people.
Imagine how easy.
Yes. So, and I think, people can feel that when you feel attacked and you kind of assume that defensive crouch position, either physically or, um, figuratively, you're not doing your best work and you're working out of fear instead of out of innovation and creativity and, oh, let me get better, even challenge or push me to get better. Those types of things are all things that will pull you forward versus crouching down. Um, on the flip side of that, I just spoke with someone about working with Gen Z, and we were having this back and forth conversation. And when people say, "Oh, I feel this way, and therefore, I'm gonna do the minimum amount, or I'm not gonna engage with the work fully." Is there a balance? Is there a mix? How do we distinguish between, all right, certainly physical safety and certainly psychological safety are important, and then it is you also have to do the work even when sometimes you don't feel like it because you're tired or you're stressed or it's challenging and difficult. Is there a place for that in the discussion?
I think so, because I think they're all related. If you are forever in survival mode,
Yeah.
it's going to make you feel stressed. It's going to make you feel tired. It's going to make you feel disengaged. So if you have a workplace where those things are minimal, all of a sudden people just get to do their work and they get into those flow states. And a whole different conversation. I think Gen Z is kind of onto something, right? Like they're paying attention to how some of these things feel, and they don't want it. I know it sounds a bit snowflakey, but a couple years ago, I was kind of reacquainted with a term called weathering. And the gist of it is that there are certain things that happen when people feel oppressed, whether it, regardless of which version of oppression. And it could be the bullying, harassment, any of it. But when people are constantly forced to protect themselves, um, constantly forced to be on guard for what might happen next, it has a way of hurting our physiological systems. So it's not just something that feels bad in terms of psychological safety or insafety, but it's actually having an impact on our well being physically. It hurts our cardiovascular system, it hurts our neuroendocrine system, our metabolic system. And in fact, now the research is showing that this is why certain marginalized groups did a lot worse during the pandemic. It wasn't because they were sickly people, it's because their whole systems have been compromised from this ongoing oppression. So, knowing that, now I'm very careful about who I will work with and what kind of media I will consume because it's going to have an impact on everything. So, these young folks, even if they haven't heard of weathering, somehow they're just healthier in the sense that they don't want to do things that are going to be bad for them. We know that organizations that provide food or spa services or gyms or that kind of thing, they're always reviewed from a health and safety perspective. But the truth is that most of us are going to bounce back a lot quicker than we think. If we're, I mean, I'm not saying we should eat poisonous food that's like, not food poisoning, or we go into dirty spas, right? So, but the point is that most of us will recover from those harms a lot faster than somebody will recover from constant microaggressions, being passed over repeatedly for promotions, uh, all kinds of mistreatment. But we don't pay enough attention to bad behavior at work. We don't necessarily rein it in as
Good.
much as we should.
Yes. So if someone, in the US, we have at restaurants these little kind of food safety papers that say excellent, good, not good, poor. And your description made me think of, oh, if someone were to do a check, like a health safety check of a workplace, what rating would they get? Some of them you would be shut down, and some of
That's
them are excellent. So they have the excellent rating. So, what are some things if an executive is listening to this and saying, "All right, well, I absolutely want my place of work to be a place where people look forward to coming to work and can do their best work." What are some things they can, one, look for, and then two, do and implement to foster that?
well, informally, most people know who's toxic in a workplace, right? Like there's often a few people who anyone who works around them doesn't seem to last very long.
Mm.
Like certain people seem to inspire a lot of turnover, a lot of absenteeism,
Inspire a lot of turnover.
right? So paying more attention to that is a good start. Being more intentional when we're hiring so that we don't accidentally hire people who are problematic, who are cruel, who are cutthroat, who are manipulative.
So just to jump in there, so for the tactical and practical piece of what you just said, is it looking at the data, looking at the stats, like, oh my gosh, we have if we're looking at voluntary turnover across the org, there's something clearly unlike the others, like in this department or in this team. Let's take a look at that and see if that's an issue. And then on the other side, it's when we're bringing people into the organization, we must make sure they're a good culture fit. We have to make sure that they're going to fit in with our teams and people.
And I wouldn't even call it a good culture fit
Okay.
because sometimes culture fit motivates people to try to bring in new people who kind of match who's already
Mm,
there.
yep.
And sometimes you need to really focus on who can contribute and who has something to add that's missing from the team. So when I'm talking about the hiring piece, I'm talking about, of course, making sure that people have the skills and abilities and experience that's necessary for sure, but being more thoughtful during reference checks, listening to what people say and what they won't say.
Yeah.
Right? Like, nobody wants to say anything bad about somebody, but if somebody will always qualify any praise, you have to maybe probe a little bit further or ask, have there been times when that person's had a surprisingly high volume of conflict?
Mhm.
Or do other people seem to avoid that person? Is that person well liked? Is that person respectful? Is that person unfriendly? Right? Because sometimes these soft skills are surprisingly hard to develop. So if you bring somebody in who is, just generally speaking, mean, neglectful, manipulative, these are not things that are easy to fix. So it's better to try to avoid them from the get go.
All right. And this is there anything else that one can do to foster a culture of inclusion and of safety and of productive, good, creative, innovative work? Because I think if you ask most CEOs, they'll say, yes, 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 I want that environment. I want, first of all, that environment because hopefully they're a good person and they want to create that for others, but also because they want the results and outcomes, which you talked about. You're getting 100% of people instead of 70%. And you're getting new ideas brought to the table and you're getting, yes, more production work out of people. But in order to unlock that, you've got to do kind of the groundwork. So, is there anything else that a CEO or an executive team can look at to unlock that?
I think one basic thing to do is not tolerating incivility and mistreatment because we all see it. And when we just shrug our shoulders and kind of look away, then it sends a signal that it's just fine and it has a way of spreading. So if from the top we don't tolerate it among our leadership team and we encourage others not to tolerate it on their teams, then when they see it, they can hopefully call people in and if necessary, call them out, give them warnings, and if they can't behave themselves, let them go.
So, would it be modeling that? So, if you're the CEO, modeling that in your interactions with the leadership team, who
Mhm.
you work with most regularly, and then would it also be encouraged, like literally verbally saying, this is what I expect that we uphold in the company? And so obviously you are working with your respective teams more than I am. If you see this, I expect you to model the behavior and say something just like we're doing here, or just like, the environment is here.
I've seen, I don't see it often, but I've seen some leaders who, when they see these things the first time, they have a conversation. And depending on how bad the behavior is, that person's suspended
Mm.
and they get one more chance. And if they do it again, they're packaged out because otherwise it has a way of spreading.
It's like the other version of that droplet in
Yeah,
color in water. Yeah. So that
like
can
a
spread
drop
too.
of bacteria or something.
Oh, yeah, that can spread too. Yes. Oh, one more scenario for you. So let's say you're in that same leadership room and you're talking about creating a good environment, but you're not the CEO. You're someone else in that room. And maybe the CEO themselves isn't the greatest at that. How do you approach that situation? How would you try to get your get your desired outcome and message into the leadership team and across the organization when you're in a senior position, but you're not the CEO, you're not the top person?
Well, in those situations, it's definitely worth having some data to back it up.
Mhm.
I'm a big fan of Adam Grant. He talks about the impact of some of this stuff in my book. The chapter on toxic workplaces has some references to some really big, robust research and even some podcast episodes that have research references. So at least you can come with something concrete and something relatable that shows that morally it's a good thing, but also financially, practically, it's a good thing.
And that latter, I mean, the former one should get a lot of people, but the latter one certainly speaks to a lot of CEOs. So
Maybe start with the practical,
start with
own
the
it.
financial, end with and this makes you a good person. All right. So we've touched on just surface level stuff of two of your chapters in your book. Is there anything else that you would just want to let people know about, or other topics in your book that you think would be important to get out there?
Well, I'm gonna have kind of an unusual answer. So if I look at the cover of my book, it's got some chess pieces, and there's one piece that's upright, all the rest of them have fallen. So it's fundamentally about winning. But the other book cover that I contemplated had a picture of a chess piece looking in the mirror. I think it's a pawn looking in the mirror. And in the mirror, there was a crown on the person on the pawn. So I guess for me, the book is really about winning, but it's also about seeing yourself the way you actually are instead of the way other people might think you are. Because sometimes when we reclaim our potential, our humanity, our abilities, we can accomplish anything.
Well, it's funny you mentioned that, because I don't know if you can see it, but my first book has the pawn looking in the mirror, and it's a queen, which is the most powerful piece. So yes, and I've seen social media posts where there's like a little baby lion cub like drinking some water, and they see in the reflection like a big, kind of Mufasa type full
Mhm.
grown lion. So it's kind of how you see yourself, and at the end of the day, how you see yourself and what you believe you bring to the table dictates how you show up and the outcome you get. So, yes. Well, thank you. Thank you so much. So, Dr. Helen, can you say your book title one more time and where people can find that, and also if they want to connect with you, the best place to do that?
Absolutely. The book is called How to Be Resilient in Your Career, Facing Up to Barriers at Work. It's obviously available at Amazon, but anywhere you buy your online books, you can easily get it. And if you visit theresilientcareer.com, there's a link for where to buy it. So all the different places, and also details you can share with your local bookseller if you need them to order for you. And all my social links are there as well.
Beautiful. Well, thank you so much once again for being on the show and sharing your insights and wisdom. Thank you.
Welcome. I enjoyed our conversation, and I'm looking forward to continuing to keep in touch through social media to see other things that your podcast guests have to share.
Absolutely. All right. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you.
If you enjoyed today's episode, please like, share, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.